Okay, so thanks everyone for coming. I think we'll make a start. I'm sure people will grab their coffees and join us when they're ready. My name is Ben Abraham, and I'm here to tell you what game developers can do to help save the planet. And it's great to see so many of you here. We're already doing better than GDC. When I gave this talk in March in San Francisco, there was maybe this many people here at like a conference many times the size, and in a room much bigger. It felt way emptier. So that's great, and I think it's both a reflection of Australian game developers and their very strong social conscience, but also the growing sense of urgency around this sort of issue. So what this talk is about today, because I imagine some of you will come with some ideas about, what does climate action look like in the games industry? And I have a very specific and kind of maybe obsessively narrow focus to my kind of research and my activism focus. So this talk is really about reducing your emissions. That's it. That's the whole talk. Which is, it sounds, okay, overly simple, but when you get into the details of it, can really get quite complicated, even for small teams. So we're going to talk about where emissions happen, how to understand where they come from, how to just estimate them or measure them, how to get a clear sense of them as like a picture of what's kind of going on. And then I'll talk about some more kind of aspirational things that we can kind of do to maybe develop a market for green games, which I think is, there's potential around that. So I also want to say at the very front of the talk what this is not about, and it's not about what kind of games you should make, right? I have no strong feelings one way or the other, which should be encouraging to you, and I think this is like the real positive part of the message, which is that you can make whatever games you want and make them sustainably. There are ways we can do that. You don't have to make a climate game with themes about the environment and trees and plants. If you want to make the most angry, hyper intense shooter game, or whatever, you can do that sustainably. It has almost nothing to do with the content of your game. And so by the same token, I'm not talking about what games you shouldn't make. I'm not here to tell anyone stop doing this and start making games about planting trees. That's not what we're here for. What I'm here to talk about is what actually needs to happen, which is real change to address the climate challenge, right? That's the heart of the problem. So before I kind of get into it as well, for those of you who've never seen me speak before, never heard of me, never seen me around, this is my book called Digital Games After Climate Change. My background is as an academic. I've been a researcher for over 10 years now. I did a PhD on human, non-human relations and the kind of effects of networks and technology on ideas about responsibility and how we act on the world. And at the end of that process, I realized that I just had one thing that I really cared about, or maybe two things, and that was climate change. I needed to do something about this. And the area that I'd been researching and working in is the games industry, and I was like, okay, well, two and two together, what does the game industry need to do? What does it need to know? And I set out to write this book, which came out earlier this year. And it contains the first attempt at estimating the carbon footprint of different parts of the games industry. I wasn't able to put just one big overall number on it, just because of the complexity of that challenge. There's a project ongoing at the moment by one of these sort of carbon NGOs to kind of do that work. And I think there's probably $1 million behind it, right? It's a huge amount of work. So I grabbed what data I could, and I talked to game developers. I got them to share with me their kind of electricity bills and the energy consumption that they have. And then I talked to some of them. I surveyed them about attitudes towards climate change. spoiler alert, the game developers are very interested in climate change, just like the rest of the population, right? We know that most people care about this sort of stuff. And then I did a kind of very climate-oriented analysis of all of the aspects of the games industry that needed to decarbonize and how we kind of get there. And then just as a little, tack-on thing at the end, I also had what's called an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry test done on the PS4, on the APU, the little chip that does all the, the hard work of computing and making visuals happen. And I found out what are all the raw materials in that, and where do they come from, and what sort of climate impacts are associated with that. Sorry, I moved before you were you did? Okay, good. So basically, I think we can all agree, if you're in this room, I think it's read that we know it's a climate emergency, right? Like shit is getting real out there. You look out the window and you just see it's floods, like the recent floods in, what was the most recent one? We had Lismore, had some out my way in Penrith. This is one from like London in 2015. Before that, we had fires. The whole east coast of Australia was fucking going up in flames. This is a photo from Portugal. We have fires in California from like this mega drought, like 1 in a thousand year drought. And like every time I give a talk like this, there's been some other major climate disaster. We just had like Hurricane Ian hit like major parts of Central and North America. So, like, if there's one thing I would like you to take away from this talk, it's that no one's coming to save us, which is a really shitty thing to grapple with, and it sucks. It's on us. We have to save ourselves, and that's at the core of what I think the games industry needs to do. We can't depend on the government. They're going to do some stuff. They're not entirely fighting against us anymore, thank God. But it's up to us. It's up to like every one of us to do something. And what do we do? Well, probably this is a heavy message, I know. But if this is the first time you're hearing it, then your next question is, what do we do about it? And I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you everything that I think you should probably know, within reason, about what we need to do. So to start with, we need to understand the problem. And again, it's deceptively simple. There's way too many greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And yeah, we need them not to be there. But we also keep adding more. We are filling up the bathtub at a rate that's faster than we ever have before. Parts of the world are reducing their emissions. Australia's emissions are coming down, but the whole, bathtub of emissions is rapidly overflowing. And the ways in which we live our lives, that we do the work that we do, and the things that we occupy our free time with, that we play games, all of these things are contributing to this challenge if they are producing CO2, if they're adding to the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So what sort of emissions are we talking about? Well, this is the summary of the figures that I came up with as part of my research. So game development all around the world. If you're making games somewhere in the world, then you're probably part of an emissions total that is somewhere in the realms of 3 to 15 million tons of CO2 per annum, just from making games. That's just offices, studios making games, developers, and teams all around the world, and the power they use, the kind of fossil resources we draw upon to do our work. Distribution, again, the picture is very hard to get a clear sense of. A study done in around about 2010 found that getting PS3 discs from the factory in Europe to the UK probably emitted about 415,000 tons of CO2 in a year. And obviously it's much later than that now. My back of the envelope calculations suggested maybe Australia's getting discs from Europe to Australia, because all the PS4 discs are printed, or PS5 now are printed in one factory in Austria. And then they have to make their way to Australia somehow. So somewhere around 800 tons of CO2 per year, just from plastic discs, going from one side of the planet to the other. And then players themselves. This is like probably the big ticket one. So the study there that kind of gives us the most detailed information is Joshua Aslan's PhD thesis. Josh now works for Sony as their head environmental person. He found that all of the players in Europe playing on PS4 games up to the year about 2020 emitted about 6.7 million tons of CO2. Millions of tons. That's kind of equivalent to like a small European country, just from playing games. Or the emissions of one small country in a year, and that's, yeah, compared to games over several years. And then another study from Mills et al. In the US found 24 million tons of CO2 from all of the gaming devices in the US. And these are big numbers. It's like quite a substantial contribution to the problem. And then hardware itself, making the devices that we play games on, new phones, new consoles, new PCs. Again, it's hard. We don't have very clear data here either. But again, Aslan has this figure of somewhere between 50 to 60 kilograms of CO2 just to make one PS4, which is probably about half of its in total lifetime emissions. And if you multiply that by how many PS4s were made, that's 6 million tons. So, all right, so where do we start with this, right? These numbers have got to come down. They've got to come to zero. We can't keep going on like this. Where do we begin? Well, to explain that, I need to tell you a little bit about this idea of the greenhouse gas protocol, which is this sort of international accounting standard. It's very dry and boring, but it sort of sets up the framework for how we understand carbon emissions in any kind of business around the world. And this diagram here is from the official website, and it's an absolute nightmare to decode. I'm a professional, and I work in this area, and I still look at that and go, what the fuck were they thinking? So my simpler explanation of it is that it breaks down into 3 scopes. And scope 1 and 2 are a little nice, self-contained kind of areas. They're fairly clear and straightforward to figure out. And they are mostly owned by you or by a particular company that produces them. So scope 1 and 2 are nice, friendly, relatively easy to calculate. And then scope 3 is this giant, monstrous tentacle monster that just kind of sprawls everywhere. So scope 1 is direct emissions, any fossil fuels you burn yourself. So that might be, do you have gas heating in your building? Do you have a backup generator that's running on diesel for some servers or something? Do you have a fleet of vehicles that you operate? Any time you're burning fossil fuels, you are contributing emissions. And if you are, you'll probably know if you're producing scope 1 emissions, because fossil fuels are bloody expensive. They are not cheap. Scope 2 is any emissions that a power station makes by burning fossil fuels to produce you electricity. And that's kind of the main one. That's where I think game developers, if you're wondering where do I start? Start there. Start with your electricity, because that's probably going to be your kind of big ticket item. And the one that is basically you're most responsible for. No one else is responsible for reducing your scope 1 and 2 emissions. Scope 3 is kind of shared in terms of there are questions around who should be paying the cost or doing the work there, but 1 and 2 is very straightforward. So scope 3 emissions are fossil fuel emissions embedded in or that get produced to make or to use literally any product or service that you buy or that you sell and provide to someone else. So it's things like the computers that you buy that have been made by someone, and they've been made using power and chemicals and minerals, and the minerals have been dug up out of the ground and they come from somewhere. It's the servers that you employ and the power that they use, in a data center somewhere else. Technically, those are sort of scope 3 emissions. And then downstream, the big one for game developers is the power that players use to play your games. So yeah, I'm just going to go through these in a little bit more detail with some more sort of examples. So Scope 1 emissions. Do you burn fossil fuels? So think about natural gas, vehicle fleets, and like generators. To calculate the numbers that you use, because the way to start this is just to begin with how much you're using. Find out the data. The problem gets kind of easier if we know how big it is. And it can kind of motivate change and guide us to different sorts of actions. So find out the quantity of the fossil fuel you've used, or for a vehicle, sometimes you can use a distance-based calculation, but generally it's like, how much oil have you burnt, or how much natural gas have you burnt? And then you combine that quantity, that amount, with what's called an emissions factor, which tells you basically per the volume that you've used how much carbon dioxide is emitted. Sorry, I did warn you, it was a bit dry. It's kind of boring, but it's really, really important. And then the solution really here is just to get rid of them, right? We have the technology to replace fossil fuels. For heating, we have efficient electric heat pumps, which are like, they'll save you more than the cost of the replacement, usually within like 6 to 12 months. For like generators, we can get like backup batteries. For vehicles, we can get EVs. The solutions are out there. They just need us to like prioritize them. They can be a little bit more expensive, but in the long run, they tend to actually be cheaper. So Scope 2 emissions, this is the really important bit where I think game developers need to kind of dive right in, because for most small to medium-sized teams, I suspect you probably don't have any Scope 1 emissions anyway. Start by reading your power bill and just get that figure. Your power company charges you a fee for the amount of power that you use. And that will tell you. So the figure is in kilowatt hours. Do I need to explain what kilowatt hours are? Most people have probably heard it, but it's basically just the unit that we measure energy in. So it's 1 kilowatt. Watt is the standard unit of energy, and kilo is like 1,000 watts. And we always measure it over time. So 1,000 watts used over an hour is 1 kilowatt hour. And that's usually the standard that emissions factor figures come ready for. So we grab the consumption numbers and multiply that by the emissions factor for our local power system. So if we're here in Victoria, I think the most recent figure I saw was like 0.85 for our emissions factor. And multiply them together, and that tells us how much CO2 we've emitted for that amount of power that we have used. And again, the solutions there, we have them already. Look for ways to reduce your power consumption. Get more energy efficient heating and cooling or devices. And then if you can, pay for 100% renewable power. In Australia, we have the capacity to do that. We have a fairly privatized market-based system. Some parts of the world, like the US, they have a public utility system where you get your power that you use from the one utility, and it just is what it is. And so it's a bit harder there. But in Australia, we're sort of lucky in this way. You go back and forth on whether a privatized power system is actually any good, but it is what it is. So yeah, you can buy 100% renewable power. And then lastly, the third part is your Scope 3 emissions. And as I kind of hinted at, this is the way harder part. This is like everything. It's all the stuff you buy, it's all the stuff you sell, and the kind of emissions that people using your games come up with. So some examples of, like what kind of things you can have. It's computers that you buy, it's monitors, servers, it's desks and chairs, your office fit-out equipment, it's peripherals that they use, Wacom tablets, mice and keyboards, the paper and ink in printers. It's the flights and the travel you do to conferences like this, the data centers that you provision, and all the energy that your players use. So again, this is like, where do we draw the boundaries? Like, some of these things, like, technically exist within the realms of responsibility of other companies, right? Like, so the computer you buy, Apple has emitted those emissions. So that's why Scope 3, it's like a kind of shared responsibility. If Apple tomorrow decided to price in the emissions of the new laptop, you know, the price might be double. And so that would be extremely uncompetitive for them. So, yeah, so they might go out of business. And that's why, like, the protocol kind of is yeah, why it's sort of complicated. Why it's sort of to do with, like, markets and business and stuff. So what I recommend for game developers, and this is a thing that you can start to do, it's, you know, achievable, is start to collect play duration statistics for your games. And if you collect that and you find out what devices they're playing on, I mean, you probably have a good sense of that anyway, but where they are in the world as well when they're playing, you can combine all that information together to tell you what their kind of energy consumption is, and then get local emissions factors for those locations and tell you, okay, you know, 1 million hours of players on an iPhone in the UK means this much CO2. And then you can choose to maybe offset that if it's affordable. For console game manufacturers and PC as well, I suspect that paying for those emissions is going to be prohibitively expensive. One back-of-the-envelope calculation I did for like even just a PS4 game played for, like, you know, 1 million hours, which is, you know, not too much over a big enough player base. It was going to cost, like, you know, $100,000 or 100,000 euros, multiple hundreds of thousands of euros. I suspect most game developers don't have that much spare money lying around. So sometimes when you start to think about the emissions of your players, the temptation is to go, all right, well, how do we reduce those emissions ourselves? How can we optimize our code, or, you know, make the game run better? At the moment, I kind of can't really recommend spending too much time on that. There are some things you can do, but it's still very early days. I think the first benchmark of different coding languages only just came out a couple of weeks ago, in terms of, like, you know, which are the most efficient coding languages to use, and what's the kind of difference between them. And that's a lot of work, right? Like, if you got to rechange all of your code base from Python into, like, C++ or something, I mean, that's just not feasible. So yeah, it's really going to be up to hardware manufacturers, and I think anything we can do to kind of tell Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo, we are looking for more efficient hardware, you know, please, you know, keep focusing on this, I think will be useful. And they are, you know, prioritizing that a fair bit. So here's an example of a scope 1, 2, and 3 calculation done by Ubisoft. This is just the kind of, like, ratio breakdowns. You can kind of have a look at their reporting if you're really interested in it. On their kind of website, you can just go to their annual reporting documents and scroll down. So this is a good breakdown. It tells you, like, all right, what are our typical kind of emissions totals going to look like in terms of their kind of balance. So for Ubisoft purchases, this includes, like, purchased power, purchased, I don't know, like, food. That was the kind of the main thing, right? It was like electricity and energy. And the other elements that are, you know, decent size are things like buildings. So the emissions of, like, heating and cooling in buildings, data centers and that sort of stuff. So one thing that's really encouraging is that Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo all have net zero targets. And maybe one kind of thing to keep at the back of your mind is that the potential is there in the future for these platform holders to start to demand more attention in this space, right? So I could imagine 5 years from now, Xbox saying, you want to be on Game Pass? Well, you need to know what your studio's footprint is, right? Microsoft has one of the most ambitious and thorough net zero targets of any company in the world. They want to be fully net zero by 2030, and then they want to remove all of the emissions from the atmosphere over the lifetime of the company by 2050, which is like, that's huge. So yeah, and I can imagine like that's scope 1, 2, and 3. So if you are publishing on the Xbox platform, that's going to be in there, right? They're going to start requiring this sort of stuff. So lastly, in the last sort of 10 minutes of the time that I have, I want to talk a little bit about what we can do as developers beyond just kind of addressing our emissions, because I know that's kind of the boring stuff. It's not really very sexy. It doesn't maybe necessarily help your business hugely. It's important, but yeah, what are other things we can kind of do that might line up? So is there a market for green games? Well, not at the moment, but I think if you understand the kind of gaming audience that we are reaching and making games for, and gamers have a very strong social conscience. Many of them do. And I think just like we've seen issues of diversity, of equality, social justice become really important to game players, I think climate justice is the next one. We need to start thinking about like, how can we meet those demands that players might have, of us? And there's good research behind this as well to suggest that consumers, just like us, also care about, improving conditions on planet Earth. This is a survey from back in 2018 about consumers and their interest in environmental issues. They found that 81% of global respondents felt strongly that companies should help improve the environment. And yeah, so like we think about that at the moment mostly in terms of like, I don't want Nescafe to be chopping down trees and deforestation and stuff, but like, as awareness of every area of business and life starts to spread out, and its environmental impact starts to spread out, what are players going to demand from us? So some of the other research, there's heaps of research on sustainability and audiences. Most of it comes out of the fast-moving consumer goods industry, which is sort of about like commodity goods. So it's a little bit kind of iffy whether this like directly translates to games, but I suspect that, it's going to start appearing more and more. And one of the key takeaways from this one, this was a report from Mintel, I believe, was that basically consumers still need a good product, right? And I think they will see, how do I put this? Consumers are not going to be swayed by like, green branding, and they still need a good game at the end of the day. So that's kind of encouraging, right? Like if you're a good game developer, yeah, making green games, making your game sustainably is probably not going to earn you extra sales, but over the long term, it might lose you some if you don't. Your competitors, you're also making good games, but doing it sustainably, they might be like, well, I'm going to play this instead. Kind of like how we saw gamers respond really positively, well, really negatively, I guess, positively from my perspective, to NFTs, and saying like, no, we're not going to take this, extra cost to the environment. So if this all sounds like a lot of work, I mean, it is. It's hard, and I think it's unavoidable though. Like it's stuff that we've got to do, and we can kind of put it off, but it's got to happen, one way or the other. I think federal governments, national bodies, funding bodies especially, are going to start expecting us to do a bit more and do a little bit better. And there are so many good resources out there now. The two best ones that I really recommend you go and check out if you're interested in more detail on this is the Yuki Green Games Guide. That is so thorough and so detailed. It's like, I read that and was like, damn, they're going to put me out of a job. They did all my work for me. And then the IGEA Climate SIG, which is, just a really fantastic dynamic group of people who are all, really passionate about the games industry, and they're developers. And they're constantly like coming up with new resources and material to kind of make things easier. But there is like a lot to learn in this space, right? And I'll give you an example of like a couple of pitfalls. Both Nintendo and EA, when they did their first environmental corporate social responsibility reports. They stuffed it up. EA got the figures wrong. They were off by 1,000. It's very easy to get your kilowatt hours, megawatt hours, gigawatt hours all mixed up. And then EA already did that. Nintendo just missed something, moved it into the wrong column, and again was out by 1,000. Now that's kind of fine if you're just reporting your data, but if you are then doing something with that, using that to inform your business or to buy offsets even, then that's going to maybe cost you 1,000 times more than it should have, which means you're probably not going to be affording it. Or you're drastically underestimating the real cost. I guess the next question is, can I just pay someone to do this for me, right? This is a pain in the ass. Well, yeah, there are companies that are doing this stuff now. South Pole, GCAP, Endeavour Environmental, and this plucky little startup you might have heard of called After Climate, which, is my business, which we just launched kind of last month. So, little plug for me. If you're ready to kind of do something in this space, if you want to take action, but you feel like, I don't want to have to do all that work, well, if you want, I would love to do it for you. I'm exactly the kind of sicko that gets excited about digging into the data and figuring it out and going, all right, how do we make real reductions? So yeah, please get in touch and talk to me after this session, or reach out on Twitter or via the website. And let's do something. So to wrap up, and we got heaps of time for questions. Just sort of blitz through this, I guess. The bad news is that we got to do this ourselves. No one's going to make it happen for us, and no one's coming to save us. There's no bolt from the blue. It's just hard work. And we start doing something by doing something with what we can control ourselves, right? Like our own emissions, our own electricity, our own consumption. Just do something, find out what the data tells you. Find out what the figures are, and then go from there. And then tell someone about it. One of the things that I find kind of odd is that the games companies that are doing really well about this are not, making a big song and dance about it. There's a real opportunity, I think, to celebrate the achievements that companies like Space Ape have made. They went carbon neutral in 2018, and they're going to be carbon negative in a couple of years. Tell your publisher, hey, this is a thing we could do. We can market it as a green game a bit, maybe reach a slightly different audience. Tell your friends, family, anyone that will listen, and let's build some momentum for this. Thanks. So, heaps of time for questions. They've asked me to remind you to use the microphone to ask them. So, please come up. Hey.
I imagine that one of the biggest challenges is, I guess, the work, and making it as easy as possible for people would make it a lot better. Do you know of any companies that are essentially creating a API that tracks player energy usage and then automatically offsets that and bundles that in with some sort of certification? Because if it was that easy, then I think a lot more people would actually be using it versus all of the work that's required and nobody asking you to do the work, which is probably a huge challenge.
Yeah. I'm not aware of any companies doing that yet. There are probably half of that infrastructure is already in place in terms of there are APIs that will tell you at a certain time, there's one in the US called What Time, which tells you, okay, what time of the day and in what part of the US is more or less emissions intense. They don't have the other part, which says, okay, put in your energy and devices and stuff. That's kind of a bit too specific for them. Yeah. In the UK, there's a government API, which tells you, down to the level of what part of the UK you're in, what the intensity is of the grid at any given time. So again, that's just at the data there. In Australia, we have this platform called OpenNEM. So Australia has the National Energy Market. And again, that's the data. There are companies that will let you put in the figures that you figured out in terms of their emissions use, but I don't think I haven't seen any of them with an API that straightforwardly can just be like, okay, plug in your emissions and get the data live, and then we'll kind of add it up and offset it. And I suspect maybe that's not that appealing from a certain perspective too, because essentially what you're doing is you're exposing yourself to almost unlimited number of offsets, right? Like you're saying, okay, let's say overnight you get like 1 million new players and they all start playing, and they're all playing on PCs in particular. While you're asleep, they maybe rack you up a bill for $1 million that you can't pay. And that'll, I don't know, if that's automated. Yeah, it's hard. So I think that's interesting and definitely worth exploring, but I don't know of anyone doing it yet. Yeah.
Cool. I also wanted to ask the question in case anybody else wanted to be working on that, because that sounds good, and one person should do it for everybody.
Yeah, please get in touch if that's you.
Hey Ben, great talk. I don't know if this is too early to kind of have a good idea about it, but have you noticed like any positives from the shift to remote working in terms of emissions? Like, and if that's like something to really argue for, like to kind of help reduce their carbon, like the emissions and whatnot for a company?
Yeah, great question. So I have actually, and it's sort of disappointing because you want it to be like, yay, all positive. But actually, there was a study done, I think, last year or early this year in the EU, which found that it's not straightforward in terms of it's just, yes, an emissions reduction, because what ends up happening is, depending on where you are in the world, depending on the time of year that it is, heating your own home for 8 hours a day versus all being in an office and heating that, there's just an efficiency trade-off there.
Right.
And so if you're in, say, Sweden, and you're working in Sweden over winter there, everyone working from home is actually maybe an emissions increase, because you are, you're heating like, if you're a 100-person company, 100 people's houses now for 8 hours a day that you wouldn't have before.
Right.
And that's a real bummer. But in other ways, there are benefits, like so outside of winter, everyone at home, because it's warm, you probably don't need to do much cooling in Sweden in summer. And so in that way, it actually is a reduction over that part of the year. So it's not straightforward, and unfortunately.
Yeah.
But I think generally speaking, and the thing that I didn't kind of mention here is that renewable energy basically is the closest thing we have to a silver bullet. And so as soon as we like reach the point of 100% renewable electricity grids, a lot of this stuff just suddenly stops being as much of a problem, right? Like, because people can use as much power as they want at home or in the office, and it's just like, pay the bill and it's fine. But we're probably 10 years away from that.
Yeah.
The G7 has a target, it's the 7 biggest economies in the world, of hitting 100% renewable, net zero electricity by 2035. And I think some of them even want 2030. That's 8 to 10 years. And basically, like 8 to 10 years from now, it's a radically different picture. But until we get there, there's like a lot of work to be done. And and working from home, I think it's good generally, just from like every other perspective. So probably it's worthwhile in the end, and eventually it will work its way out.
Oh, cool. I didn't consider the heating part, so like
I know.
Oh,
I was
thinking of computers and like commuting. That's all I was kind of like was thinking.
Yeah, so like you do save a lot on the commuting, but if people were already commuting by like public transport anyway, like you're kind of not saving that much. So it's complicated, and it's a real complex picture.
Ah, cool.
Yeah.
No, thanks, man.
Great question. Thank you.
Hi, Ben. Long-time listener, first-time caller. I've just been wondering, looking at the research that you've done, whether you've looked at any of the collective efforts of workers within their own workplaces to push for their employers to go, I guess, more green with regards to the work that they have to do. I'm aware of some efforts at places like Google, Atlassian, and Canva, and I'm wondering whether you've encountered anything in games.
Yeah, so there is a bit. There's certainly nothing as organised as like climate workers at Amazon or the climate workers at Google movements, which are great, and I'm big fans of them. What there is at companies, the one that I know of mainly is Wargaming Sydney. So there they have a kind of environmental working group where employees who have an interest in this do a lot of the kind of work for the company to say, like, all right, well, how do we figure to reduce waste in this thing? So a couple of examples they told me were they changed from kind of single-use yogurt purchasing for the kitchen to like a big tub, and then they got rid of disposable plastic in the kitchen and instead got reusable cutlery, and they just clean it up. And also like other things like paper, they looked into like what paper should we be using in our printers and copiers and stuff like that. So yeah, I think having it be like kind of bottom up driven by employees saves a lot of headaches for everyone, because then it's just better to kind of operate that way as well. We just are in a situation where a lot of the games industry, a lot of the decision makers at the very high level, heads of Sony, Microsoft, Unity, Nintendo, they're already kind of on board with this in a way. But the companies where they're not, we need to kind of figure out what ways do we exert pressure on them to have them, get on board. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thanks.
And I definitely recommend that those people who are interested join the union.
Yeah, talk to some of these people. Yeah.
Thanks, Ben. My name's Tom. I'm from Keyword Studios. I just thought I'd share some of our recent experience with this, because it probably speaks to a couple of the points that you've made today. So we surveyed our staff in July. We had the 17 UN goals for sustainability. We asked them which was the biggest priority. Climate change came out for 80% in the top 3.
Yeah,
So we knew
not
that
surprised.
No, absolutely not. And so we made a decision to engage Endeavour. We got Endeavour in. They did an audit for us, and they gave us a report. And as of the 1st of July, we're now carbon neutral.
Hooray!
So thank you.
Nice.
But in terms of that process, that's been less than 3 months to go from an idea to being fully carbon neutral. In terms of our emissions and looking at our emissions, some of the data that we've got, 50% of our total emissions was electricity. So for us, it was very easy to move to green immediately. So, Giselle did that literally overnight, and we reduced our carbon footprint by 400 tonnes in one foul swoop. In terms of the offsets from employees, and people were talking about the difference between remote working and commuting, certainly in our experience, and we had a full audit done by Endeavour, and they essentially surveyed every single person. They identified how they were travelling to work, their home electricity issue was quite in depth. About 6% of our emissions were from commuting. But 6% of our total emissions, but 6% were from working from home. So it was about even.
Same,
actually, they could actually come into the office and commute, and it would be the same. So we're now, we've reduced our total emissions by half by moving to green, but now we've looking. The next phase for us is to actually think about how not only do we offset, but how do we begin to reduce those emissions, and we're doing things exactly as you just mentioned, engaging employees to identify gaps. But the reality of it is the biggest things that you spoke about in terms of the waste, the use of computers, etc., they're very, very small percentages. So our second biggest, I'm just reading the data here, electricity was number 1. The second biggest one for us was professional services, and the third biggest was flights. Now, flights will increase, obviously, during COVID. We didn't take a lot of flights. That's easy to do offsets. But then it was employee commuting and working from home, and then ICT services and equipment. But even that was only 4%. So we've got 175 employees, and all the computers that we were using, everything else that you think about in terms of the IT infrastructure, only accounted for 4% of our total emissions. So, yeah, you can certainly make changes there, but in terms of shifting the dial in a big way, there's probably other things that can be done first.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Absolutely. Big ticket priorities, really, really important.
Like we have no section 1 emissions.
Yeah.
And we didn't look at the usage of the games. We sort of thought that was a step too far, and to your point, could potentially, when you're working on some of the most popular games in the world, bankrupt us. But in terms of the cost, I mean, the process was easy. We got some guys to do it. But in terms of offsetting, you know, what is it, a 12 to 60,000, depending on where you go per. Sorry, $12 to $60 per tonne. For us to offset our entire emissions, even at the most expensive rate, is going to cost less than the cost of one half of a developer. So it's not beyond the pale. Like, it's not a huge expensive exercise for us. It was a no-brainer, and I'd encourage everyone else to do that. And certainly, engaging someone like yourself or Endeavour in our case just made the whole process so much simpler.
Fantastic. That's great news. Thanks, Tony. So we have 3 minutes, so maybe, the last two quick questions.
Yeah, it's just a very short question. The game that we've developed has got strong environmental themes, and the sequel that we're working on, ditto. It just occurred to me to wonder if there's a way that we can get or encourage players to offset their own emissions. For example, I don't know if there's some way that they can go to some kind of site and do some kind of, I don't know, do this much and you'll plant trees, and then that gives you a code which you then use it as a discount code for the game or something like that. I wondered if there were systems like that available.
So nothing that I think is super easy. Like there are just like kind of a couple of barriers between it. I think the main one for players is that it's not easy for them to figure out, right? Like if you have an office, you can just go, all right, here's my electricity bill. That's all that I've used for game development. If you are working from home even, and you have developers working from home, it's harder to disaggregate the kind of work energy and the work emissions from, your whole power bill. And it's the same for players too. So, I would love to see more tools in the hardware kind of surfacing that information to players about, like, okay, you're using 60 watts now or something, and you've played for this many hours and this, but it's not really there yet. The closest thing that I know of is that there were, I don't know exactly how public this information is, but there were a couple of Xbox Series X's that got sold, and they added like custom power telemetry in them. So like somewhere out in the world, there are these like, 1,000 Xboxes or whatever that just have this like secret measurement running of like what's the actual power number. And it doesn't tell the people who bought it, it's just an Xbox to the outside, but they did a few of them like this. So Microsoft is collecting some of that data, and I would love to see more platforms kind of do that and surface the information to players so that they can then go, oh, all right, I've used this much emissions, I can go pay this much to offset.
But even if it's not about them knowing what they've used, but just, go and do something that plants some trees, and then come and buy our game and we'll give you a discount off it.
Yeah.
If there's some way to do it.
Yeah, Sony did that thing when they did the launch of Horizon, the most recent Horizon, where like, if you complete this achievement, we'll plant a tree for you, which was nice. It's a nice little marketing thing. In terms of like the emissions that's offsetting, I don't know if it's balanced up, but it was a nice little thing. Yeah, thank you. And we got to wrap it up. Do you want to talk afterwards maybe, and we can?
Yeah, let's talk afterwards. I was a bit late, so you may have answered my question.
Okay, all right, cool.
I just wanted, as a comment, to say that Humankind, which was the game that I worked on before, very nearly shipped without global warming as a game system. And the team essentially rebelled and pushed for that to be included.
Oh, nice.
For better or for worse, because it was a little bit unbalanced at release, But yeah, it shows that dev teams, as a rule, are very interested in these issues and really want to push for these things.
Yeah, great.
So it's really
Awesome.
great that people are doing this.
Cool. Thank you. All right. Thanks everyone for coming.